South Africa has an online disinformation crisis. Right now, there are many groups of people, campaigns, networks that are spreading disinformation and misrepresenting the reality in this country to try to advance their own agendas, to trick you into thinking that certain things have happened when they haven't, or that certain things are a much bigger problem than they are, in order to try and influence South African society. They are orchestrated, targeted, strategized campaigns by a few people to mislead lots of people across the country. So let's look at two of the biggest, most successful disinformation networks. And through that, let's understand and be able to spot how disinformation is being used on South Africa's social media, particularly Twitter, to mislead South Africans. This is the issue with disinformation networks on South African social media. And this is the issue with Dan Corder. South Africa is a movie. Welcome to the watch party. It's great to have you here. If you're a genuine first-time viewer, a few things you need to know. Firstly, all of our video episodes also exist with deeper analysis on podcast, on all of the podcast streamers. Secondly, we have a Patreon account where for a small monthly subscription, you can support the show, help us keep the lights on, and get once a week exclusive expert interviews with top South Africans working on the biggest issues facing the country. Finally, it would be super wonderful if you subscribed to the channel. It is a painless and cost-free way for you to help us grow the show together. Right, let's get into disinformation. Kamaran Pizza wears many hats. Not like me, like literally, no. Metaphorically, many hats. He's an author, he's an associate professor, he's a researcher, but for the purposes of this episode and the interview we did with him that's on Patreon if you want to get the deeper cut, he is the head of an organization called the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change. The CABC was set up in 2020 to analyze and monitor South African social media, to study networks of disinformation that are trying to influence discourse and public conversation in South African life, and how those campaigns are trying to influence our politics and our business. Now, important to clarify as we start the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So, misinformation is fake news and untruths that are spread by accident by people who truly believe that the things that they are spreading online are true. Disinformation is fake news and untruths spread by people who know that it's fake and untrue and are trying to dupe and trick others when they share that material. So before we get into these two massively successful campaigns, Radical Economic Transformation and the xenophobia broadly understood under the Put South Africa First banner, let's talk about how disinformation is created by networks of people with a strategy on social media. The simple answer is lies and marketing, which in some cases is the same, but okay, I don't want to upset all the marketers watching this. Sometimes you tell the truth creatively. When a group of people want to pull off a disinformation campaign, they build a network of accounts on social media. Most of them are anonymous. Some of them are pretending to be a fabrication, a fictional identity like Ulerato Pillay. And the group of people controlling all of these accounts, some of them are controlling 10, 20, 30 or more at a time, they all agree that when one of those accounts posts from one of them, all of the rest of the accounts will interact with them, which boosts those posts in the algorithm. They will retweet, they will like, they will comment, because the algorithm can't tell the difference between people who are authentically, sincerely supporting a position and those accounts that are just blindly boosting any other account. And the problem for anybody else on Twitter looking at this is that we can't tell the difference when we see a post, whether it has been authentically supported by a large group of people or inauthentically supported by a small group of people controlling lots of accounts who are just interacting the hell with it. This is called astroturfing, and it's a kind of disinformation, because what the campaign is trying to do is convince you through that appearance of interaction that way more people care about this new song or xenophobia or radical economic transformation than actually do so, especially if they get so much interaction that they cause posts or hashtags that they're using to trend. Because then you go onto Twitter and you look at this and you think, wow, a lot of people care about this. And so you believe, you experience in that, you trust and believe, as Cheryl Cole once said, that's a deep cut for the oldies, you trust and believe that this must be a big issue facing, in our case, South Africa. And some of the duping is extraordinary, by the way. Like in the research that the CABC, Kamara and Peter's organization does, they have found accounts with like less than 1,000 followers that don't tweet for like 10 or 12 months. And if you go into those profiles, you will only see them suddenly tweeting about one thing and nothing else, reposting and interacting with one topic. And it's so obvious when you go and look, but like we general social media users don't have the time to go and look and debunk and to think about all of this. And it's insane. Some accounts are tweeting faster than it's humanly possible for humans to tweet. But these accounts, if you're not going and looking for them, will get away with that and influence the algorithm. And from the CABC's research, you can see how orchestrated and designed it is sometimes. Like there will be a certain hashtag tweeted about on average, maybe 1.5 or 2,000 times a day. And then suddenly, randomly in one afternoon with no big news story or anything to like promote it or push it to South Africa's attention, suddenly it's got tens of thousands of tweets out of nowhere in an afternoon. So that's the marketing, which does feel a lot like lies, because what the accounts are trying to do, what the network is trying to do, is make something seem like a much bigger issue than it is. Now the lies, the disinformation, because what these accounts, these networks do quite smartly is they don't just post fake news that they can't defend, because then they'll be called out and actually their posts won't travel as far over time. No, they mix it in with legit news. They try and muddy the waters so you don't really know. You can't spot in a tweet or a list of posts on a particular hashtag whether or not there are falsehoods in those claims, because they mix in truths. But that means it's incredibly hard to track which accounts are doing what, while most of them are peddling some disinformation. You've seen this before. There'll be a video of like a horror attack by one person on another, and an account will claim that it's a foreigner in South Africa committing an attack on a South African, and later someone else will make the point that actually this video came from another country with another group of people like 10 years ago. But that account is also tweeting truthful data about South Africa's, number of illegal immigrants who are crossing the border without permits, for example. So they managed to get mass virality on a hashtag and feed in disinformation. And the result of that is suddenly we South Africans start talking about it, particularly because most of the world's media is still very dependent on Twitter, and so much mainstream journalism is still written from trends that are happening on Twitter, even though it's got a tiny user base compared to all the other social media platforms. But it became a place of discourse for people in media. And so if these disinformation networks can get things to trend on Twitter, they can very easily then influence or trick a journalist into writing about this as if it's a much bigger problem than it is. And this has happened a lot in South Africa, like a lot. But it's not just journalists being duped, it's everyday South Africans, because more and more South Africans then sincerely do start talking about whatever the network is trying to push, because they think it's a bigger deal than it is, and then they take it on as a big crisis and speak about it, and then it becomes authentically a bigger crisis than it should be. Rank, simple deception. And eventually, if these campaigns are successful enough, they have genuine political consequences. They create such a groundswell of interest and fear and worry through that deception that they actually get political leaders to start dancing to that tune. A radical economic transformation campaign that was run by some British company called Cambridge Analytica was invented and then used to push what is broadly understood to be the pro-Zuma or Zuma faction of, actually, is it still of the ANC? They've got rid of so many and now Zuma's suspended, but you know what I'm talking about. He's still spinning that narrative even as he's been suspended from the ANC and many of his allies have been removed from the African National Congress. When he said that he was not campaigning for the ANC anymore and fighting for this new party, Umkhonto we Sizwe, he said it was because the current ANC leadership is sellouts and apartheid collaborators, which works straight into the RET narrative. Now, looking at what we've just learned, here are a couple of things that the RET campaign did that made them so effective. The campaign to push RET created a vast network of inauthentic accounts run by, we don't actually know how many by, but they were accounts that would only tweet about this and then they were dormant for a long time, and accounts that were suddenly created and then they only retweeted and posted about certain issues. And they also coalesced around certain influencers, people who'd built significant followings, including people purporting to be journalists on YouTube whose shows you may have watched. And the RET campaign was incredibly good at mixing in disinformation with true facts. Remember that their core contestation about how white minority capital as a cabal controls the country, controls the politicians, controls the business and the media, and it's all in white people's hands, is easy to spin because the majority of massive companies in South Africa are still owned by white South Africans as a legacy of apartheid and the fact that in capitalism, once people get to the top, they kind of stay at the top and inequality widens and people who've accumulated money accumulate more and more money. And there's been very little time for redress and giving enough time and opportunities to black South Africans of color to actually rise and accumulate massive amounts of wealth. And so because that is true, that is fertile factual information to then work in the disinformation about how there is an intentional cabal of people who are trying to keep black people down, even though there's no evidence of that. Radical economic transformation was exposed, but it's still going and is still one of the most effective influence networks in South Africa, and genuinely managed to take an idea that was concocted, as I said, in a business, in a boardroom in London, and turned it into a major political issue in South Africa that has had real ramifications at the ballot box. But now let's talk about what is right now arguably an even bigger campaign, an even more successful campaign. It's the xenophobic campaign that can broadly be described as Put South Africa First. It involves Operation Dudula, this vigilante organization that's going around terrorizing and often meting out absolutely unjust, unacceptable violence against foreigners, whether they are legal immigrants and have papers or not. It involves this newly surging group of right-wing parties that are going to be contesting in the election this year, like the Patriotic Alliance with their leader Gayton McKenzie, who've been pulling off these stunts at the northern border. The northern border, they're all northern. It involves Herman Mashaba and his Action SA party that did incredibly, almost record-breakingly well in their first ever election. They debut in the local government elections in 2021 in Gauteng on a very strong security, fear-mongering, the foreigner is the problem narrative. To be clear, I'm not saying that Gayton McKenzie and Herman Mashaba and their political parties are behind this Put South Africa First, this xenophobic campaign on South Africa's social media. I'm not saying that. There's no evidence of that. There's also no direct evidence that RET was going all the way back to Zuma. But it is important when looking at these campaigns to figure out whose agenda the campaign's message strengthens, suits, helps. And when you know where to look, it's actually very easy to see these campaigns for what they are, disinformation. Just go and look on Twitter on hashtag Put South Africa First or search Operation Dudula, hashtag Operation Dudula, and just scroll. And you will see the vast majority of these accounts are small with very limited followings. If you go into their profiles, you'll see they almost automatically repost only certain accounts, tweet about only certain things, suddenly tweet so much, like every few minutes for like 12 hours a day, and then nothing after that. And most of them have blue ticks, which means that the owners of these accounts have bought them a subscription, which means they get better treated by the algorithm. And you can see the political motivations. Back around 2020, 2021, most of the top tweeted users were either anonymous accounts or they were Herman Mashaba. And more recently, the most top tweeted users, that means the ones who are being blessed by these disinformation networks and promulgated, pushed forward by them, are members of the Patriotic Alliance and the African Transformation Movement, the ATM. And again, if you go and look at the CABC reports or you just go and do your own looking on Twitter, you'll find that the accounts that explicitly exist to push the Operation Dudula campaign, that hashtag, often also push the Put South Africa First campaign and vice versa, which is suggestive of a relationship between the operators of all these anonymous accounts behind the scenes, off the record, out of public eye. And that makes sense because they're both pushing the same thing. They're trying to create hysteria around foreigners and illegal immigrants in the country in a very Trumpian American way. They're trying to make it a massive issue of contention for the upcoming election. They're trying to push an agenda that will clearly help more right-wing parties that have been pushing this xenophobic rhetoric. And what this campaign has successfully been able to do in the last few years is make the issue of illegal immigration or undocumented immigration way bigger than it actually is. People in South Africa now believe that there is this absolutely unstoppable flow of migrants, that they're overrunning communities, that all crimes committed by gangs are committed by gangs of foreigners, even though the truth supported by real data and real evidence from real analysts and real investigators, shows that all of that is nonsense. But these campaigns have managed to create this sense online that most South Africans, or many South Africans, are beset by and struggling with and deeply concerned about this issue of undocumented migrants. And that has had political consequences. It has meant that even the ANC and the EFF are now really talking about and thinking about foreigners and thinking about the border, and they've successfully managed to make it an issue that will affect this upcoming election through duping, astroturfing, disinformation. And if you remember, we've actually spoken about this before when we spoke about the awful Joburg inner CBD building fire that happened. You can go and find that episode on YouTube and also on our streamers, where I spoke about the fact that I was on air doing my radio show that morning as the news broke of this terrible fire. And before any journalists or authority figures or even ambulances could get to the scene and report the truth, there were these accounts tweeting that it was foreigners in this building, foreigners who'd caused this fire. It was overrun by foreigners, this building, foreigners, all of them were illegal. Somehow these accounts knew this. And by the time most South Africans woke up, all of these accounts were the top trending accounts for Joburg CBD fire. And more South Africans were waking up to these tweets, these posts with thousands of likes and retweets from this disinformation network, but it looks the same as authentic groups of people supporting and agreeing with a tweet or a post. Those were the top tweets. And so people woke up and reasonably thought, wow, this is migrants. Somebody must have checked this. And unfortunately, by the middle of the day, when people did rock up and find out the truth, which is that there was a combination of South Africans and migrants living in the building, and it was unclear whether they were documented or not, by that time, it was too late. And that disinformation, that moving before the facts were even available to try and create the seeming energy that these facts had been already established, that disinformation had already spread and worked in with this campaign's motivation. So now you know. I hope this information was helpful. I hope it will make you feel more cautious and less instinctively trusting when you're on a place like Twitter. And again, if you want to hear the full fascinating interview on this topic, head across to our Patreon. Small monthly subscription helps keep the lights on and of course gets you this once a week expert interview. And this particular one with Kamara and Peter, so vital as we head into a 2024 election season that will be affected by disinformation networks. Thank you so much for watching The Issue with Dan Corder. We'll be back in a few days' time with our Thursday episode of News Worth Knowing. Really appreciate your time and attention. Don't forget, if you haven't yet, we'd love a subscribe on the channel if you found this video helpful or fruitful. Makes a massive difference as we develop the show. See you in a few days.